melt her skin. Officer Boone's deranged cackle echoed under the scorching sun as he tilted a pitcher of orange-yellow acid over Eleanor's nape, the old woman pinned to the ground by Harker. Each thick, viscous drop fell onto her neck, causing her wrinkled skin to painfully discolor. He raised the pitcher higher, preparing to douse her head completely, a triumphant smile, a petty power cloaked in cruelty. But, mere seconds later, a large hand calloused like forged steel suddenly seized Boone's wrist. He shrieked in pain as his arm was wrenched, the acid pitcher shattering on the ground. Harker was slammed to the ground in an instant, and Boone was disarmed with a single swift kick. The man, his chest not even heaving slowly, shed his jacket, revealing 2 silver stars and a golden trident rear Admiral SEAL Marcus Reed. Amidst the swirling dust and chaotic screams, the moment that calloused hand reached out changed everything, transforming a brutal street assault into an indictment of the corrupt racist system America had never dared to confront. Can a single hand redefine justice, or merely usher in a nightmare for a nation drowned in silence? If this were your grandmother, having acid poured on her neck solely because of her skin color, how long would you endure? Share your thoughts, and watch the full video to find out what happened next. At noon, Magnolia was so hot, the ground seemed to steam on its own, a thin layer of dust rising and falling instantly, as if scorched mid-air. The dirt road leading into the poor black neighborhood stretched out under the blinding sun, flanked by run-down wooden houses, spaced about 100 or 150 meters apart, all so weathered it seemed a strong gust could shake them to their foundations. Mrs. Eleanor, 70 years old, small-framed, her shoulders slightly hunched with age, wore a faded red shirt, washed carefully clean, and stepped slowly toward the only pharmacy still serving the poor in the area. She shielded her chest with one hand, clearly feeling her heartbeat under the blazing sun, but still tried to walk a little faster. Her heart medication was running low and she didn't want to have to come back again that day. People living in the row of homes on either side of the road gently pulled back their curtains to look out, their eyes filled with the quiet worry they'd carried for years. No one called out to her. No one opened their door. They only watched from behind thin fabric. They knew exactly why silence was safest, because in Magnolia, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could turn into trouble. Many people here had been harassed by police just for walking down the street, stopped and questioned with nonsense, and insulted for no reason. As they heard the soft shuffle of Mrs. Eleanor's footsteps across the dry dirt, a few curious children peeked through the curtains, only to be pulled back by their mothers, who whispered just loud enough for her to catch. "Get back inside. It's not safe to be out." The whole neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Days this hot were when the police were most likely to drive by looking to pick a fight with someone black. Mrs. Eleanor knew every eye was on her, but she kept her steps steady. She had lived in Magnolia her whole life, seen generations of black people treated unfairly until it became a kind of constant fear anchored deep in the chest. She had taught her children and grandchildren one rule to survive here. When you walk, keep your eyes down. If you see the police, step to the right. Don't talk back. Don't argue. She herself had been stopped a few times, questioned harshly. "Where are you going? What are you doing? Do you know anyone around here?" even though they knew she'd lived there for decades. Each time she nodded, answered softly, let it pass, but every time she got back home, her hands would shake from fear. The sun hit the road directly, making her shadow stretch longer than usual, dragging along the dusty ground like a dark streak in the middle of blinding light. She glanced down at her worn shoes and told herself she just had to make it to the top of the hill. Everything would feel lighter then. The small pharmacy sat behind an abandoned church where poor residents often went because they couldn't afford the larger clinic in town, especially when the staff there rarely treated black folks with decency. Today, she was alone. Her granddaughter was watching the newborn, and she didn't want anyone else to have to suffer in her place. The wind picked up, carrying the heat smell of metal from the tin roofs, dry dirt, and smoke from somewhere in the air. She squinted against the dust, then kept walking. Cracked steps, tangled wires, rusted-out cars abandoned in yards, things outsiders would call dangerous. But to the people living here, it was just home. Mrs. Eleanor used to believe Magnolia might change one day, but year after year, things only got worse. The town's officials poured money into fixing up the white part of town, building new homes, opening shops. But where she lived, it was like the map forgot it existed. She hadn't yet reached the end of the dusty stretch when the heavy growl of an engine roared behind her, so loud it felt like someone had fired up a chainsaw right at her neck. A Ford Interceptor sped up and screeched to a halt just inches from her feet. Red dirt flying up and covering her clean red shirt like someone had thrown it on her on purpose. She flinched, stepped back, one hand pressed to her chest in the instinctive gesture of someone who'd lived a lifetime in a place where the police were danger, not protection. The car door swung open hard, a sharp metal slam cutting through the noon heat and making a few nearby curtains twitch. Two men stepped out with the kind of swagger that came from believing they owned the town. Deputy Cole Maddox, tall, cold-faced, his mouth always twisted like he was chewing on a half-finished insult, and Deputy Ryan Holt, tight-built eyes sharp like he was always looking for a target. Maddox looked her up and down, gave a sneering smile, then spat out in a thick southern drawl, "Look at that. Trash walking in the middle of our damn road." Holt stood beside him and just snorted like the sight of an old black woman walking down their road was the most unacceptable thing he'd seen all day. Maddox walked up with the swagger of someone used to holding power over life and death in a poor neighborhood, shoulders slightly hunched forward, hand resting on his holster, as if Naomi, an elderly woman so frail a strong wind could knock her over, were some kind of threat. The sun hit his face, revealing a sneer full of contempt, the kind of smile worn by someone who believes laws only apply to the weak. Holt stood close behind him, eyes flicking down to her faded red shirt before jerking his chin, his voice sharp and sour like a needle digging into skin. "Red shirt, huh, makes you easier to aim at." The way he said, it wasn't a question. It was a knife's edge, meant to make it clear he saw her as a walking target under Magnolia's suffocating sun. Naomi paused for a beat, her hands clutching the corners of her cloth bag, eyes deliberately avoiding theirs. She knew looking directly would only invite more trouble. For a moment, she heard the rustle of curtains from a few nearby homes, a sign the neighbors were watching. But no one dared to speak. After so many years living in Briarwood Bend, she knew the unwritten rule. Poor black folks never win arguments with the police, especially not with these two. Maddox had a reputation around the neighborhood as the most hot-headed in the squad. Holt didn't talk as much, but the cold, straight look in his eyes was enough to scare anyone. Maddox stared at her without blinking, then kicked the cloth bag hard. A pillbox tumbled out the lid, popping open, scattering heart medication into the red dust along the road. "You spying on us, huh? You poor folks are always sneaking around." He said it so casually, like it was just a fact of life, like the right to insult someone came standard with the badge. Naomi bent down on reflex to gather the pills, but Maddox stomped down just before her hand could reach them so hard she had to pull back from the pain. He looked at her out of the corner of his eye, voice curt and flat, the tone he used for every black person in the area. Holt crossed his arms, standing at an angle, watching with the kind of look that said he enjoyed seeing old people pushed to the ground. He stepped forward and lazily kicked a pill farther out of reach, then spoke with a drawn-out tone, both mocking and tired. "People like you are always wandering around like we've got time to track every step you take." Naomi stepped back half a pace, clutching the fabric of her shirt over her chest, trying to stay calm, even though her breath was quickening. "I'm just getting my heart medicine." she said softly, her voice shaken more from fear than age. That simple sentence didn't make Maddox or Holt back off. If anything, it made Maddox laugh louder, a dry, sharp laugh as she'd just told a joke. People behind their curtains heard the laugh clearly. Some gripped the edges tighter. They'd seen this kind of scene too many times before. Someone whispered again, like this was just the latest rerun of a tragedy the whole community had to endure. Naomi stepped forward again to reach for the pillbox, but Maddox blocked her with his foot, looking down at her with a strange kind of enjoyment, the look of someone who knew he had the power to humiliate anyone in front of him. He growled out the words, "Didn't you hear me? Where do you think you're sneaking off to, Naomi?" Bit her lip, steadying her voice. "I have a prescription. I was going to the shop down the hill." Holt smirked and cut in with a low voice. "Prescription, sure, everyone's got an excuse." That short line added fuel to the fear rising in her chest. The pills had rolled toward the gutter dust, coating them so thick she knew she'd have to throw most of them out. But what made it harder to breathe was Maddox's stare. It wasn't looking for truth. It was looking for a reason to come down on her. She understood in an instant that no matter what she said, they wouldn't believe her. To them, someone like her was already wrong. She tried to stand a little straighter, despite the aching in her back, despite the sting of the sun in her eyes. "I wasn't spying on anyone," she said quietly, but clear enough to hear. Maddox gave a low grunt, leaned in closer, close enough for her to smell the old smoke on his collar. "Go ahead and keep talking. No one's gonna believe you." She took a deep breath, hanging on to the last pieces of courage she had left. But she knew this conversation wasn't about the truth. It was a game, one where the men with the power played and no one dared to push back. The dust still hung in the air. The heat still pressed down like it meant to burn everything away. And the road through Magnolia suddenly felt twice as long as Naomi realized she'd just stepped into something she wouldn't be getting out of easily. Maddox stood just a few steps from Mrs. Naomi, his eyes narrowing like he was weighing how much the small old woman in front of him deserved to be hurt. He didn't say another word. No warning. His fist came straight at her stomach with the force of a man used to solving things with punches. His hand was hard and strong, and the blow landed just below her chest, snapping her backward before folding her in half like something had yanked her down with an invisible string. Her breath cut off a choking sound, caught in her throat, but never came out her chest, too tight with pain to pull in air. Instinctively, she clutched her stomach, her whole body trembling slightly, trying to stay upright, but her knees gave way. The space around her seemed to close in for a second, the harsh sunlight turning blurry as her vision spun. She fought to keep any sound from escaping her throat because she knew even the smallest noise could trigger Maddox again. She'd seen others in the neighborhood beaten, just for crying out, for trying to resist, for looking a cop in the eye. All of it had taught her a cruel, simple truth. Silence keeps you alive. She held her hands to her stomach, bent slightly, her legs unsteady for what felt like an eternity. Holt watched and didn't show the slightest intent to stop it. On the contrary, he stepped forward like he'd been waiting for his turn. Before she could catch her breath, he planted his foot in the middle of her back and pressed down hard. The pressure shoved her face toward the ground, red dirt sticking to her skin and lips, the heat from the road burning straight into her flesh. She braced with her hands to keep from collapsing fully, but Holt pushed harder, forcing her body flat against the dirt. Her hands scrambled for something solid, but all she found was scorching earth. Her breath came in ragged bursts, gritty with dust burning her throat. Holt leaned down, putting more weight on her back, his voice low and harsh, scraping her ear like metal against a wall. "We're just getting started. You people are always whining." Each word dropped slowly and deliberately, like he was savoring the poison in them. That sentence made a few curtains in the distance flutter, maybe from the wind, or maybe from someone gripping the fabric in anger or fear. The kids inside who heard it didn't dare peek out. They knew words like that always led to something worse. Mrs. Naomi could feel Holt's boot pressing into her spine, the weight sharp enough to send a searing pain down to her hip. The smell of dust, her own sweat, and the singe of her skin from the hot ground all blended until she had to close her eyes just to stay conscious. Above her, Maddox stood like it was just another show to pass the afternoon heat. He bent down, picked up the medicine box that had fallen earlier and slammed it onto the ground in front of her. A few pills rolled out coated in thick red dust, like a symbol of the growing despair in her chest. "Start screaming, I don't hear nothing yet," Maddox said. His voice was eerily calm, like he was asking for a prescription or posing a casual question. Mrs. Naomi didn't dare open her mouth. Her breathing came in short, shallow bursts. Holt pushed down harder, forcing her face deeper into the dirt. Dust filled her nose. She wanted to cough, but held it in, knowing the reflex could make him stomp harder. Maddox took another step forward, standing right in front of her, looking down with a mix of contempt and amusement. He spoke slowly, each word meant to be heard loud and clear. "You poor folks always the same. As soon as you see a cop, you shake like a wet dog, still think you got the right to walk down the damn street." His words dragged up every memory of times she'd had to swallow her pride, bite her tongue, just to avoid the kind of trouble men like him brought. Sometimes she wondered if the misery in Magnolia came not from the poor themselves, but from people like Maddox and Holt, who kept dragging the whole place down. Holt shifted his foot slightly, sending another shot of pain through Mrs. Naomi's back. Then he added in a clipped southern drawl, "You better know your place out here. Don't make us teach it to you again." That made her chest tighten. Her hands moved slowly over the ground as if trying to find something to hold on to, something to anchor herself. She wanted to get up to push back to end this, but she knew if she did, it would only get worse. The sun still pounded down hard, but it wasn't the heat that scared her. It was the cruelty pressing in from all sides. The pillbox rolled to the edge of the road, then slid a few more inches and dropped into a shallow ditch nearby. The sound of plastic hitting stone was sharp enough to make Naomi flinch. She gently reached out, trying to grab it, even though her palm still burned from being dragged along the ground. That heart medicine had taken her weeks of saving to afford. Losing it meant she'd have to endure chest pains for many more days. But before her fingers could touch the edge of the box, Maddox stepped forward and slammed his boot down on the back of her hand. The force didn't just make her pull back, it made her bite her lip to keep from crying out. Her skin was thin, her bones more brittle with age, and Maddox's heavy foot pressed down like it meant to crush every joint in her hand. He looked down at her, his mouth curling slowly into a smirk, the kind of smile worn by someone who knew he could do the worst and no one would stop him. Naomi tried to pull her hand away, but Maddox kept his foot there as if savoring the feeling of his soul pressed against the flesh of someone who'd done nothing wrong. Dirt clung to the fresh scrape on the back of her hand, stinging more with every breath. In the front yard of a nearby house, a small child, maybe 7 years old, ran out. His eyes went wide with shock when he saw Naomi's hand under that boot. The boy started to rush forward, his mouth open as if to call out, but an arm reached from inside the house and yanked him back. His mother held him tight against her chest, her face peeking just past the cracked door. "Don't go out there, you hear me," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. Her face was full of fear, not fear of Maddox or Holt seeing her, but fear that her child might end up suffering what Naomi was going through. Holt stepped forward, hand on his belt, eyes tight with irritation like beating an old woman in the street wasn't enough to let his anger out. He leaned down, towering over Naomi, and spoke with a flat, cold voice, thick with the disdain the people of Briarwood Bend knew too well. "You've been following us since last night, haven't you? People like you always pull that kind of thing." His words dropped into the heat-thick air, sharp and clear like tiny blades slicing skin. That baseless accusation cut straight into the deepest wound of the community, the wound of always being assumed guilty before getting the chance to speak. Naomi shook her head weakly, her breath still uneven from the punches and the weight pressed on her back. Even so, she forced her voice loud enough for Holt to hear. "I wasn't following anyone. I was just getting heart medicine." Her voice was raspy from the dust, and the fear pressing down on her, but her words carried no weight for the two men standing over her. Maddox let out a cold grunt, then finally lifted his foot, only to shove the pillbox deeper into the ditch with the toe of his boot. He watched her reach for it again uselessly, and his eyes lit up with quiet satisfaction. From the houses lining the street, the curtains shifted again, this time more noticeably held open longer. It was clear that more people were watching now than before. No one stepped outside, but eyes followed every move. A few hands slowly raised phones, fingers trembling from a mix of fear and rage. They knew filming was the only way to protect the truth, but they also knew if Maddox or Holt noticed things could get worse. Still, something about seeing Naomi's hand crushed like that made it impossible to stay in the shadows any longer. Cameras, shaky and hesitant, began to rise lenses aimed straight at the two officers. "Quit actin' innocent." Holt continued his words bitter and acrid like burnt rubber under the sun. "We don't trust people like you." He leaned in closer, and Naomi had to turn her face to the side to avoid his cold stare. "Around here in Magnolia, we know exactly who's always spying, who's lying, who sings a sad song just to get a check." His voice punched each word, and behind the curtains, some gripped their phones tighter, straining to hold back the anger building inside. Naomi didn't reply because she knew anything she said now could become the excuse they needed to hurt her worse. She just looked toward the pillbox in the ditch, her eyes filled with quiet despair, but still holding on to a thread of calm. Partly because of age, partly because she was used to this kind of injustice, so used to pain that she'd learned to swallow it. Behind one slightly open door, the mother held her child and whispered, "Don't look anymore." But she kept looking, too, because the sight in front of her hurt too much to turn away. The air in Briarwood Bend felt frozen around the weight of false accusations, the sound of boots on skin, and the gasping breath of an elderly woman just trying to survive another day. But in that silence, the trembling phones being lifted, finally were the first signs that the long-held silence of this neighborhood was beginning to crack. Maddox glanced around the barren street like he was checking if anyone dared step out to stop him, then bent down to open the side compartment of the patrol car. He pulled out a small metal cup silver, but dulled from frequent use. Inside was a thick orange-yellow liquid, giving off a sharp, biting smell that made the already stifling air even harder to breathe. He raised the cup to eye level, gave it a slight shake, so the liquid rippled, then held it still just as the sunlight hit it, making it glow in a strange, menacing way. "You know what this stuff does?" Maddox asked, voice low but clear across the red dirt road. "It peels your skin off like onion layers." He didn't say it as a threat, but the way someone brags about a new toy. He tilted his head and looked at Mrs. Naomi. His eyes twisted with a hint of satisfaction when he saw her eyes widen in fear. For a moment, she forgot the pain in her arm, forgot the punch to her gut, because that liquid looked like death creeping in slowly. The heat from the cup, mixed with the sun, made it feel like she was standing inside a furnace. Her breathing became shallow, each breath weaker than the last, her eyes locked on his hand. The medicine box, drifting in the ditch, no longer mattered. This new fear pressing down on her chest was heavier than any heart attack. Holt stood behind Maddox's arms, folded across his chest, gently kicking at a pebble near his boot like he was watching a traveling show. He looked at Mrs. Naomi, then at the cup in Maddox's hand, and let out a short, dry laugh. "Do the show, Maddox. Bet that black skin cooks quick." The words sliced through the air, sharp and bare, like something he'd said 100 times before to other victims. Nothing in his voice hinted at hesitation or pity. It was just the sound of a man who hurt people for a living and called it work. Mrs. Naomi instinctively raised her hand to shield her neck, a small, desperate movement that made Holt laugh louder. Her throat tightened. Her breathing turned ragged. Every inch of skin on the back of her neck felt like it was bracing for a burn. Every second passed more slowly than the longest winter. She had lived 70 years in Magnolia, been humiliated, searched, and questioned without reason more times than she could count. But never before had she come face to face with something that could end her life in just minutes. "Please, please don't," she said, her voice choked with dust and fear. She couldn't speak louder. Her throat trembled and each word seemed to fall to the ground and vanish before it reached his ears. She wasn't calling for help. She knew in Magnolia crying out was like talking into empty space. No one would run into the street. No one would open their door, because anyone who stepped in could be next. The silence behind the curtain said it better than any explanation. Maddox stepped closer, lifted the cup higher so the sunlight hit the liquid and reflected onto Mrs. Naomi's face. "Look at it," he said. "See how long your skin can take it." He tilted his head slightly, watching her reaction like an artist studying a brushstroke. His eyes were focused, full of sick delight. The thick liquid in the cup sloshed gently with every small move of his hand, not spilling, but just enough to show her that one slight tilt would send it onto her face, her neck, wherever he chose. Holt stepped in closer too, leaning near her ear, his breath hot, the stench of sweat so sharp she wanted to recoil but didn't dare move. "You know what we hate most," he said, voice low but cuttin'. "Old poor folks walking around acting all innocent." Mrs. Naomi gripped the edge of her shirt tight, trying to keep herself from shaking, knowing the more she trembled, the more they'd enjoy it. Her eyes drifted toward the pills in the ditch, like they were the last familiar thing in a day that had turned into a nightmare. From the nearby houses, a few shadows peeked through the curtains again. A man stood behind his door holding his phone, but not raising it. A mother clutched her young child, covering its eyes, though her own gaze stayed locked on Maddox holding up the acid. They knew that what was happening could happen to any of them. In this town, their skin alone was enough to make them targets for men like Maddox and Holt. Maddox chuckled softly, scanning the street like the only audience he needed was the people hiding behind curtains. "See that," he said. "Everybody watching us work and not one of them says a damn thing." He raised the cup a few inches higher, and the light hit the liquid just right, making it glow like a sliver of the sun melting in his hand. Mrs. Naomi pulled her head back slightly, her small shoulders trembling, her mouth open but silent. Her breathing sped up short, fast bursts, and her heart pounded so loud she could hear it crashing inside her chest. She whispered again, "Please don't," quieter than before, like a breeze about to die out. Maddox tilted his head, leaned in closer, and his smile carried the same cruelty so many in the neighborhood had known. "Beg," he said. "I want to hear how you beg." Holt laughed behind her, a sharp, mean sound that made her whole body shrink. The street sank into blistering heat, and a silence so full of fear and fury it made it hard to breathe. The houses, lining both sides of the dirt road, stood still, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath with Naomi. Behind the curtains, a few silhouettes pulled back, then peeked out again, hands trembling as they clutched the fabric. Some held phones, palms slick with sweat from the fear of being seen. Others gripped their children's arms, holding them tight to keep them from running outside. The kids in the neighborhood were used to sudden shouting or the sound of boots hitting the ground, but what they saw today made them press deeper into their mothers' chests. Every breath in the area grew faint, almost silent, as if each family forced itself into the shadows, hoping not to be noticed. An old man in the house nearest the scene narrowed his front door to a sliver, just enough to see through. His face was drawn the wrinkles deeper from the harsh sun and from the generations-old fear that had lived in this place. He leaned his head toward the woman behind him and whispered, voice low but heavy, "Don't go out there. Those cops kill without blinking." His wife didn't answer. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder and squeezed. They had lived in Briarwood Bend too long not to know what happened to those who stepped outside when Maddox was angry. They'd seen young men beaten right here on this street. They'd seen a middle-aged man stopped for wearing a shirt that was too loose. They'd seen a teenager arrested for attitude. To them, the police brought danger, not protection. A light breeze swept across the dry earth, but it wasn't strong enough to mask the sound of liquid sloshing inside Maddox's cup. He looked at Naomi, raised the cup to eye level, and slowly tilted his hand. A single drop of orange gold fell to the ground in front of his boot. A sharp hiss followed immediately, small but piercing so clear it made the people behind the curtains freeze. The dirt where the acid landed darkened, and a thin wisp of smoke rose fading quickly in the bright sun. That one drop said everything Maddox meant to say. No explanation needed. Whatever was in that cup could destroy flesh faster than anyone could react. Naomi shrank back, her arms pulling in across her chest as if she could shield herself from what was coming. Sweat mixed with dust streaked her face, but all she could feel was the heat rising along her neck like death getting closer every time Maddox lifted his hand. She heard her own breathing, short and rapid, then her heartbeat racing as her eyes followed the liquid shifting in his cup. That single drop on the ground was a warning enough for her mind to imagine what would happen if Maddox tilted just a bit more. Holt stood close by, leaning down to look at Naomi like she was some cornered animal. He lowered his voice, eyes narrowing with amusement. Look at her, shaken like a baby bird. He let out a short laugh, the kind people make when they enjoy someone else's fear. He nudged Maddox with his elbow and added voice flat like he was commenting on an object, not a person. Too easy, Maddox. Look at her. She's already lost her mind. Inside the houses, some residents raised their phones higher, not fully hidden behind curtains now, but just enough to catch the scene. The glow from their screens lit up their faces, faces caught between fear and resolve. One young woman held her phone in both hands, her chest rising and falling with tension. She knew if Maddox spotted her, she might end up dragged into the street like Naomi. But seeing a 70-year-old woman shaking from being threatened with death was something she couldn't look away from. People in this neighborhood had been silenced for too long. They understood that today's silence would be tomorrow's repeat. Fear wrapped around them every day, but the cruelty unfolding before them forced their trembling hands to hold their phones steady. Maddox noticed a flicker of movement from one of the homes. He glanced for a second, then turned back, not the least bit concerned he was sure no one would dare step out. He lifted the cup, gave it a little shake so the liquid rippled again, the orange gold flashing in Naomi's eyes like a final warning. Her knees weakened, and she had to brace herself against the ground to stay upright. She heard Holt inhale, heard his laugh, heard Maddox click his tongue as if he were deciding what kind of pain to inflict next. That moment stretched longer than Naomi's entire life in Magnolia. Every time she'd been dismissed, every time she'd swallowed her tears just to make it through another day, every cruel word she'd endured over the years, all of it collapsed into the thick, choking fear that now wrapped around her. But heavier than fear was the despair she felt from behind the curtains. They couldn't step out, couldn't yell, couldn't run to her. They'd lived long enough to know that standing up to the police in Briarwood Bend was the same as signing your own sentence. Maddox tilted his head. Sunlight sliced across his face. Scared, he asked, voice soft but laced with poison. Naomi lowered her head, tears dropping into the red dust, vanishing into the earth where no one could see. The whole neighborhood remained behind those thin curtains like spirits trapped between fear and fury, knowing they were witnessing something unforgivable, but powerless to stop it. Maddox gave his wrist a slight twist, tilting the cup just a fraction more, just enough for a single drop of orange gold liquid to break away from the metal rim and fall. The drop fell slowly, as if intentionally stretching the moment so Naomi could see it coming. She tilted her face up on instinct. Holt's weight pressing into her back made it impossible to turn her head in time. The drop hit the skin just below her ear, so hot she couldn't comprehend how human flesh was supposed to withstand it. The skin, where it landed, turned dark brown, then deep red, and a thin trail of smoke rose, letting her know just how powerful it was. A faint, burnt smell crept into the air, enough to make the onlookers cover their mouths in shock. Naomi bit her lip hard, trying to hold in any sound, but her body reacted faster than her will. A groan slipped from her throat, small and choked, like the sound of someone trying to hold on to the last shred of dignity. The groan of a 70-year-old woman pinned under the sun, threatened with something that could eat through skin. She tried to stay quiet, but the pain spread from the burn up into her shoulder, tightening her chest. Her heart pounded unevenly, as if it was ready to give out right there on the road. She inhaled in shallow breaths, each one pulling scorching air into her throat and burning her eyes. Maddox leaned in closer, his breath hitting her hair cold against the brutal heat. He tilted his head and brought his mouth near her ear, his voice dropping to a whisper like someone sharing a cruel secret. Say one more word. He didn't have to raise his voice. Every syllable landed with a clear message. He was enjoying this, the feeling of someone trembling under his control. That sentence hit her like a needle to the heart. She held her breath, afraid that another drop might fall. Holt was still pressing down on her back, his boot heavier now, like the groan had been a signal to push harder. He looked down at the fresh burn changing color and let out a short, sharp laugh, just long enough to send a chill through anyone who heard it. "Look at her shaking like a leaf," he said, his voice steady and sweaty, like this was a game he'd played too many times. His eyes flicked quickly to Maddox's hand, waiting to see what the senior cop would do next. He shifted his foot slightly, pressing harder into the ridge of her spine, forcing her to brace herself with both hands on the ground, just to keep from collapsing. Inside the houses on either side of the road, the sound of tense breathing started to merge an invisible tension that was impossible not to feel. A few people moved deeper into their homes to block their children's view of what was happening, but their phones stayed pointed at the street. They had recorded plenty of run-ins between police and neighbors, but this was the first time they had seen Maddox use that kind of liquid. They knew this wasn't just intimidation anymore. This was something that could kill, and they weren't sure if they had the courage to keep filming until the end. An older man, standing behind a door, whispered, "Dear God, he actually did it," then covered his mouth so Maddox wouldn't hear. A woman in the house next door clutched her child tightly, her hands shaking so badly the child had to ask quietly, "Mom, what's wrong?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on the cup in Maddox's hand, terror rising in her chest because she knew that with someone like him, even the smallest excuse was enough to tip the whole cup. Mrs. Naomi shifted slightly, trying to pull her shoulders inward to lessen the burning sensation spreading from the burn, but Holt pressed his foot down harder, forcing her face into the red dirt. Hot sand stuck to her cheek, mixing with sweat into a gritty paste that scraped like sandpaper. Every breath dragged dust into her mouth, making her choke back a cough she had to suppress, afraid the sound would only excite Maddox more. She felt each uneven beat of her heart, clearly stabbing hard on the left side of her chest, a familiar pain she had lived with for years. But today it was sharper, making her fear she might pass out right there. Maddox took a step back and studied the burn on her neck like a hunter sizing up prey. "Just a light touch, and you're already groaning," he said, his voice half mocking, half admiring. He reached out and flicked her hair aside to get a clearer look at the reddened skin, a gesture both intimate and cruel that made her shudder and want to pull away, but she couldn't. He lifted the metal cup a little higher, the thick liquid sliding along the rim as if ready to drip at any second. Holt glanced around and muttered, "Careful, they might be recording," then laughed right after. "Hell, let 'em film. Who's gonna believe 'em?" The words hung in the air like a door slamming shut on whatever small hope might still have been left in Mrs. Naomi's chest and in the hearts of those watching from behind their curtains. Phones trembled in shaking hands, but no one dared lower them or step forward. Mrs. Naomi tried to part her lips, wanting to say anything, but all that came out was broken breathing. Her neck burned the heat from the wound spreading down to her collarbone. The sun beat down, shrinking her space to breathe each inhale, carrying the fear that Maddox might tilt his hand just a little more at any moment. The entire Briarwood Bend neighborhood sank into a tight, suffocating silence, the kind that comes before something even worse. In that moment, though, Mrs. Naomi had spent her whole life enduring injustice. She had never imagined she would be brutalized like this on the very road she walked every day. And the most terrifying truth was not the drop of acid that had burned her skin, but the silence of those forced to watch because they had no power to save a life unfolding right in front of them. Maddox raised the cup even higher, his grip so steady that the liquid inside didn't so much as ripple. The noon sunlight swept across the metal surface and passed straight through the thick orange-gold liquid, making it glow like a small flame suspended above Naomi's head. He held it there longer than necessary, deliberately dragging out her fear until it reached its limit. The shadow of the cup fell onto the ground beside her, dark and sharp like a blade. Naomi looked up, her eyes filled with unhealable panic, because she understood that all it would take was the slightest tilt of Maddox's wrist, and the skin on her neck and face would burn right in front of the people watching from behind the curtains. The air around them seemed frozen. The dust that usually drifted lazily in the breeze now stood still. No one inside the houses dared take a deep breath. No one dared exhale loud enough to be heard. The entire neighborhood was forced to witness, unable to move. Magnolia's midday heat was already heavy, but this moment was even more suffocating, as if the sun itself paused for a beat to watch what was unfolding. Naomi trembled so hard that her hands no longer obeyed her. Her fingers opened and closed helplessly in despair. Her eyes locked on the cup, silently begging for some miracle to stop Maddox. But deep down, she knew a man like him didn't stop because of someone else's fear. That moment stretched out like a whole year, and as Maddox held the cup steady, everyone watching knew this wasn't a threat anymore. This was about to be real. Holt stood beside him, leaning in slightly to get a clearer view of Naomi's face, his eyes lit with sick delight. He gave a cold chuckle, like a man watching a play he'd seen many times but still enjoyed. His boot stayed pressed into her back, and every shift of his weight made her spine ache with pressure. In her breathing, the smell of hot dirt, burnt skin, and raw fear all blended together. And then, with her mind cornered and overwhelmed, Naomi spoke. Not because she meant to challenge them, not because she thought it would save her, but because she was too terrified, too hurt, too desperate. Her voice came out warped, shaking, but loud enough for Maddox to hear clearly. "Last night, I saw you take money behind the old warehouse." The words hit the ground heavier than the hiss the acid made. Not loud, but loud enough to make the people behind the curtains widen their eyes. The hands holding phones clenched tighter. What did she just say? They wondered. What had she seen that she wasn't supposed to? And more importantly, what did it mean now? At the very moment Maddox had a cup of acid raised over her head, Maddox froze for a few seconds. His arm, still holding the cup in the air, didn't lower, but the muscles in his face twitched. It was subtle, but clear to those watching closely. His lips closed. The crooked grin disappeared. Holt paused. His foot stopped pressing down. He turned his head toward Maddox as if trying to confirm what he'd just heard. The air shifted again like the low rumble before a storm. Maddox slowly lowered the cup, his eyes locked on Naomi with a mix of shock and fury. "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice dropping into something low and dangerous. Naomi bit her lip, knowing she'd said something she couldn't take back. Her breathing sped up, her eyes darting for a way out, but there was only hot ground, red dust, and two men she had no chance of escaping. The truth she had just let slip was like a sharp blade cutting through the old fear she'd lived with for years. Holt leaned in closer, his expression turning from smug to tense. "What did you say you saw?" he asked, voice low. No more mockery, no more jokes. He needed to know. Inside the homes, people looked at one another, their breaths shaky. An older man looked at his wife and whispered she saw it. A woman covered her mouth, her eyes wide with dread. They had heard rumors about Maddox and Holt taking money from underground dealers in town, but no one had ever dared to say it out loud. The only person brave enough to say it to their faces was Naomi, and she said it with a cup of acid hanging over her head. Maddox turned to Holt, his eyes flashing not with fear, but with the survival instinct of a man who'd done too many wrong things. He gripped the cup tighter as if he might crush it. "That old bitch is lying," Maddox said, but his voice didn't carry the same confidence it had before. Holt nodded quickly, but his eyes stayed locked on Naomi, not with amusement now, but with a wary edge, like she wasn't a victim anymore, but the most dangerous witness they'd ever faced. Naomi shook with each breath, her chest rising fast, her eyes fixed on the dusty ground below her face. She knew she had just opened a door that couldn't be closed. The two officers no longer looked at her like prey to be toyed with, but as someone who could take everything from them. A second later, both of their faces went pale as they'd just realized what her words could destroy: careers, money, freedom. In that moment, Naomi's fear shifted into their fear, and that was what made all of Briarwood Bend start holding its breath in a new way, because in the eyes of Maddox and Holt now flickered something more dangerous than the acid in that cup. Holt looked straight into Mrs. Naomi's face, then turned to Maddox, his voice low but urgent, like someone standing at the edge of a deep pit. "Maddox, this old lady needs to disappear." The words came out without hesitation, as if he were just stating something that needed to get done, not deciding the fate of a human life. Holt's breathing changed short and fast, and his eyes shifted from amusement to the look of someone about to commit another crime with no way back. Maddox squinted, his jaw twitching slightly. He looked back at Mrs. Naomi, then scanned the still silent street. "No one's gonna believe her," he said through clenched teeth, "but we gotta be sure." His voice had lost all humor. It was tight, like a man who knew one wrong sentence had just blown open what he and Holt had managed to keep buried for so many years. He glanced at the cup in his hand, then rotated his wrist to check how much liquid was left. The small motion sent a flash of sunlight bouncing off the orange-yellow surface, a bright, burning threat. Mrs. Naomi heard every word they said, even with her face pressed into the dry dirt. Her heart pounded wildly off rhythm, the familiar pain pulsing on her left side a warning she knew well. But today it cut deeper, and she feared she might lose consciousness right there. She understood this had gone far beyond intimidation. They didn't just want to hurt her. They were thinking about killing her to silence her because what she knew had exposed what they had hidden for years. All of Briarwood Bend felt frozen. No one spoke. No one screamed. No one ran out because they knew that stepping in now wouldn't just mean one dead body. An old woman in a nearby house clamped her hand over her mouth to keep from crying out, her shoulders shaking. A young woman, holding her phone, lowered it just long enough to wipe away tears, then raised it again, still trembling but trying to keep filming. For 20 years, this neighborhood had stood powerless, watching its people shoved to the ground, beaten, searched without reason, humiliated. But today was different. Today smelled like death, and everyone could feel it. Maddox stepped closer, his shadow falling over Mrs. Naomi. He raised the cup of acid once more, this time without hesitation. "Goodbye, trash." His voice was cold, flat, no anger left, only resolve. The words came out smooth as if rehearsed, saved for this exact moment. Holt watched the motion with a wary eye. He scanned the street quickly to make sure no one was stepping out, then gave Maddox a small nod. That was the decision. Not a mistake, not a loss of temper. A decision to kill a 70-year-old woman because she had seen what they couldn't let anyone else hear. Mrs. Naomi heard the words goodbye and knew her body might shut down in the next few seconds. A single bead of sweat rolled from her temple down her face, but she didn't have the strength to wipe it away. Her breathing weakened, her back burned from Holt's pressure, and the burn on her neck still felt like it was pressed to hot coals. She tried to close her eyes to find a moment of peace, but the image of that orange-yellow cup flared up behind her eyelids. Maddox tilted his wrist slightly. The liquid inside shifted to one side, close to spilling. The midday sun cut through it, lighting it up like fire, casting a terrifying orange glow across his face. Some of the neighbors let out faint, involuntary gasps when they saw the motion. They could hear their own hearts pounding like they were the ones being threatened. A woman behind a door whispered, "Somebody stop him," but it wasn't directed at anyone because for 20 years no one had come to save this place. Holt leaned down near Mrs. Naomi's ear, his breath brushing her dust-covered gray hair. "Well, you got anything left to say?" he asked casual, as if he wasn't about to watch someone's life be taken. Then he stepped back to give Maddox space to pour. Mrs. Naomi opened her eyes. They were clouded with age but still held a flicker of desperation. She wanted to say something, but her body was too weak. Her voice caught in her chest, her throat only letting out short, broken breaths. She wasn't thinking about herself anymore. She thought of her granddaughter waiting for the medicine. She thought of the little house at the end of the road. She thought of the poor but peaceful meals she had once fought to protect. But Magnolia had never let people like her stay safe for long. In that moment, the whole neighborhood felt like it had fallen into a dark dream. A child hiccuped from holding back sobs, and his mother pulled him in tighter. An old man clenched his cane so hard the tip sank into the rug by his door. Phones still pointed toward the street, but the screens were blurry with the tears of those holding them. Someone whispered, "Dear God, don't let them do this," but the words blew away in the hot wind unheard. Maddox looked down at Mrs. Naomi one last time, his eyes hard as steel. He raised the cup higher, ready to tilt it. His cruelty seemed to thicken the air around them, making every breath feel like a burden. He smirked and repeated the line he loved most, "Goodbye." And just before he tilted his wrist at the far end of the road, a collective gasp rushed out from the people watching. They knew what was coming, and they knew they couldn't stop it. 20 years of being crushed had left them frozen, watching death approach as if it were fate. That helplessness spread across the homes down the street like a heavy curtain falling over all of Briarwood Bend. Maddox lifted the cup again, tilting his hand slightly, like someone about to pour water into a glass placed at his feet. The heat from the orange-gold liquid rose visibly into the air, and the way the light hit it made it look like a piece of living fire. Holt stood behind him, eyes squinting, stepping back just a bit to avoid getting splashed, but his face showed he wanted to witness every second of it. His foot stayed planted on Naomi's back, holding her down so she couldn't turn, couldn't run. Her breathing was fast and broken. The moment was tight as a pulled bowstring, only waiting for the smallest trigger to send everything over the edge. Maddox tilted the cup a little more, a faint smirk forming on his lips. Just as the liquid began to reach the rim, a large hand came out of nowhere, grabbing Maddox's wrist from behind. The grip was so strong that Maddox lost balance for half a second. The liquid sloshed inside the cup, but didn't spill. He jerked like he'd been shocked, spun around and shouted, "Who?" His voice wasn't angry. It was stunned. No one in Briarwood Bend had ever dared step into a scene like this. The man standing next to him didn't speak right away. He was tall, solid, his body blocking nearly all the light from hitting the ground. When Maddox turned, his eyes locked onto the stranger's, and that look was cold enough to make anyone unfamiliar with it take a step back. The man's face showed no emotion, as if he didn't need to raise his voice or even scowl to make someone feel cornered. Aiden Cross stood there. No introduction, no questions, no shouting, just one hand locked tight around Maddox's wrist. When Maddox tried to yank his arm back, Cross tightened his grip slightly, just enough to force Maddox's elbow down and drop him to one knee. Holt's eyes went wide. He lunged toward Cross but froze half a step in, stopped by the way the air around the man seemed to hum like a warning. Cross spoke in a low voice, the kind of voice sharpened by years of restrained fury, clear, hard-edged, and steady. "Put the cup down." Each word came out slow and deliberate, strong enough to stir the air around them. There was no wind, no insect buzz, only that voice echoing through the street like a hammer striking metal. Maddox's face turned red from the pain, but it wasn't the grip that made him tremble. It was the look in Cross's eyes. He tried to sound forceful, but his voice cracked into a hiss. "Let me go." Cross didn't answer. He gave one final squeeze and Maddox's hand opened. The cup fell, rolled a few times in the dust, then came to a stop. The liquid inside rippled but didn't spill. Seeing Maddox drop like that, Holt quickly pulled his foot off Naomi's back and stepped between them, fists clenched ready to swing. But Cross didn't back up. Instead, he stepped forward half a pace, eyes locked onto Holt. There was a stillness in his gaze that made Holt hesitate, not a threat in the usual sense, but something deeper. The look of someone who'd seen more violence than he cared to show. Naomi was still on the ground, breathing faintly, only hearing footsteps and Maddox's groan. She tried to lift her head, but her body felt heavy as stone. Behind a curtain, a neighbor began to cry quietly upon seeing she was still breathing. The whole neighborhood exhaled the breath it had been holding for minutes. They didn't know who that man was or why he had the courage to confront Maddox right there in the street, but his arrival hit like lightning, splitting open the air that fear had turned solid. Maddox braced his hand on his knee to stand up, his face flushed red with anger. "Who the hell do you think you—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Cross raised his hand, not to strike, just held it out directly in front of Maddox. That single gesture made Maddox swallow the rest of his words like the man standing before him had the authority to cut him off without asking. Holt stared hard at Cross, his voice suddenly cautious. "Who are you? This is police business." Cross didn't answer right away. He looked straight at Holt, then down at Mrs. Naomi, then back at Maddox. His eyes changed, not cold, but sharp and heavy, like someone who had just witnessed something far beyond what his moral line could allow. When Cross bent down to pick up the cup, Maddox instantly stepped back, a reflex from someone who had just recognized the true strength of the other man. Cross turned the cup slowly in his hand, then set it down on the ground away from the two officers' reach. His movements were steady and deliberate, like someone trained to handle dangerous objects with hands that had seen far worse. He straightened up, eyes locked on Maddox and Holt. "It's over," he said, voice low but loud enough for every house to hear. "You two just crossed the line." Maddox clenched his fists but didn't charge. There was something in the way Cross stood rooted, unshaken, that told him if he took one more step, the person on the ground wouldn't be Mrs. Naomi. It would be him. The air shifted completely. The silence that had hung like stone turned into something alive, pulsing, like the whole neighborhood had just remembered how to breathe. A child pushed the door open a little more to see, and the mother reached out to pull him back, but didn't shut it all the way. For the first time that day, the phones in people's hands stopped shaking. Aiden Cross didn't introduce himself. He didn't say where he came from or explain why he was there. But the way he stood, the way he spoke, and the way he grabbed Maddox's wrist told all of Briarwood Bend that something larger than their old familiar fear had just stepped onto that street. Holt watched Cross for a few seconds, his expression shifting from surprise to caution, then turning fully hostile. He wasn't used to a strange man stepping into his business, let alone making him lose face right in front of Naomi and the whole neighborhood he'd always considered trash. He stepped back, with his right foot, clenched his fist, and lunged straight at Cross without a word. Holt's punch was aimed at Cross's jaw faster than his bulky frame would suggest, but Cross simply tilted his head half an inch and raised a hand to block lightly, as if Holt were tossing up a balloon rather than throwing his full body weight into a punch. The sound, when Holt's hand hit Cross's arm, was like a fist slamming into a wall. Holt was knocked backward, his face tightening as he realized his strength had no effect on the man. Maddox, seeing Holt getting outmatched, jumped in on instinct. He came in from the side trying to grab Cross's arms, but Cross turned to him before Maddox could even lay a hand. With one clean motion, Cross twisted Maddox's wrist outward, drawing a sharp cry of pain as the man dropped to one knee. Maddox tried to pull his hand back, but Cross added a little more pressure, just enough to make the wrist crack slightly. It didn't break completely, but it was useless for the next few minutes. Holt roared, pulling his gun from its holster, but Cross had already kicked him in the wrist with a swift, exact move. The gun flew from Holt's hand, spun once in the air, and landed a few meters away. Holt froze for half a second, wincing in pain. He tried to charge again, but Cross blocked him with a pivot of his body, moving like he was slipping through smoke, not facing two cops going all out. The strangest thing was that Cross never changed his breathing. No growls, no threats. He moved fast and with precision, every step measured like someone who could read his opponent's intent before they acted. He never punched anyone in the face, never kicked anyone in the gut, never aimed to hurt badly. He just shut them down, with joint locks and blocks so clean and effective that the two strong men couldn't grasp what was happening. When Holt tried again, Cross turned his shoulder, looped his arm around Holt's wrist, spun, and used Holt's own momentum to slam him into the red dirt. Holt hit the ground hard, dust flying up and sticking to Cross's shoes. He tried to stand, but his legs trembled too much to hold him. Maddox clutched his wrist, his face flushed with pain and anger, dragging himself toward the gun. But Cross was already there, standing in front of him like a wall. Lying on the ground, Naomi felt the change in the air. She heard running footsteps, heavy breathing bodies hitting the earth, but there were no more cruel laughs or threats. She forced her head up. Her vision was blurred from the pain, but she still caught a glimpse of Cross standing between the two staggering officers who now looked like animals cornered in a cage. Sunlight hit his shoulders, and his form was steady as stone, not the slightest tremble or rush in him. Behind the curtains, the neighbors stared at each other, eyes wide like they were witnessing something unreal. No one had ever stood up to the cops in this neighborhood, let alone taken down Maddox and Holt, in total silence. One man let out a breath like he'd been holding it in his chest the whole time. A woman whispered, "Who is that?" still gripping her phone, but no longer shaking. A child sat on the floor by the door, eyes wide, staring at Cross with the stunned awe of someone seeing for the first time an adult who wasn't afraid of the two officers that had haunted the whole block. Maddox tried to stand and lunged at Cross in one last effort. He bent low, aiming to ram Cross with his shoulder, but Cross had seen it coming half a second earlier. He pivoted to his right, placed a hand on Maddox's back, and gave a light push. Just that push was enough to throw Maddox off balance. He hit his knee on the ground and fell flat. He let out a groan, clutching his knee, his face damp with sweat. Holt tried to circle behind Cross, but Cross had already turned. He blocked Holt with his forearm and shoved him back a few steps. Holt stumbled, nearly falling again. The strange thing was that Cross didn't fight back with heavy blows, he simply neutralized them. Every time Holt or Maddox tried to attack, they were stopped before they could even touch Cross. It was like they were charging at a wall without realizing that the wall moved faster than they did. The people kept watching, but the fear in their eyes was slowly turning into something else, something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Someone nudged their door open a little wider, not stepping out yet, but no longer hiding either. An old man leaned his elbows on the windowsill, staring hard at Cross, as if trying to burn this moment into his memory to be sure it was really happening. A woman placed a hand on her chest and let out a soft breath as a small part of the weight crushing her a few minutes ago had lifted. Cross stood still, only shifting slightly to keep both officers in view. He wasn't panting, wasn't shaking, wasn't angry. But in his eyes there was something that made both Holt and Maddox shrink back. It was the look of someone who had walked through places darker than this street, someone who knew exactly how to stop cruelty without needing to say much. The two wolves, used to baring their teeth in Briarwood Bend, were, for the first time in their lives, facing a lion who didn't need to roar to command the room. And the whole neighborhood, after so many years of swallowing their pain, was now seeing something they had never dared to dream of. Holt stepped back, his hand trembling even as he tried to keep a tough face. Just a few minutes earlier, he'd been sure that no one in this poor neighborhood would dare stand up to him. But the man who had just slammed him into the ground and kicked his gun away without even breaking a sweat was now standing still as if nothing had happened at all. Holt looked from Cross's hand up to his shoulder, then into his cold, stone-deep eyes. His breath caught in his chest, and the question came out by instinct, not choice. What are you?" Holt's voice had lost its usual sharp defiance. It came out small, cracked. His face had gone pale, not from pain, but from the sense that something beyond his understanding was standing in front of him. Maddox was still kneeling on the ground, clutching his wrist numb with pain, but his eyes were locked on Cross, too. Both of them were used to bullying the weak, used to lording over this community for years. But they had never faced someone whose strength they couldn't gauge, someone who couldn't be shut down with a badge. Cross didn't answer right away. He looked at Holt for a second, long enough for the weight of that silence to hit like stone, then reached up and undid the button on his black coat. The movement was so calm that the entire neighborhood held its breath. The people behind the curtain stopped recording for a few seconds, as if they understood that what was happening now went beyond a fight or a rescue. Cross slid the coat off his shoulders. Each motion was slow and steady, like he did this every day. As the coat came off, the olive fabric caught the harsh yellow sunlight of magnolia. First, the stiff collar, then the sharply stitched epaulets, and finally the entire uniform, crisp and perfect, in a way that made it clear this wasn't for show, wasn't store-bought. It was a real military uniform, the kind people in Briarwood Bend had only seen on TV or at cemetery memorials. The sunlight hit just right, catching the piece of bright metal on his shoulder. Two silver stars came into view, glinting like tiny points of light, but enough to make everyone watching feel like they were seeing something that didn't belong on this street. A young woman recording the scene clapped her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. An old man near the doorway whispered, "Dear God," like he couldn't believe his eyes. Holt took another half step back, his voice caught in his throat. Rear Admiral." He didn't dare say it louder, afraid he'd heard wrong, but there was no mistaking the two silver stars on Cross's shoulders. Even someone with no knowledge of the military could tell that this rank wasn't for ordinary people. In Magnolia Township, there were cops, reservists, a few folks who'd been in combat, but no one had ever seen anyone from Naval Special Warfare standing in the middle of Briarwood Bend. Maddox swallowed hard, fear creeping into every breath. When Cross undid another button on the coat, the gold emblem on his chest came fully into view. A small, sharp piece of gold, an anchor, pressed against a pistol, and spread eagle wings. The trident, the symbol of those who weren't just soldiers, but men who had been through missions the rest of the world would never even hear about. The moment the people in the neighborhood saw the gold trident, their eyes changed. This was no longer just a stranger who'd shown up at the right time. This was a man who had lived in the shadows of the deepest operations, someone the government sent to do things no one dared speak of. An elderly woman trembled, hand to her chest, as if she had just witnessed something sacred. A young man, standing in a doorway, whispered to his friend, "He's a SEAL. Really a SEAL." Cross stood still and let them look. He didn't boast, didn't say a word. The olive uniform, silver shoulder boards, and gold trident said everything for him. Maddox felt his body go rigid. His hands shook so badly he couldn't push himself up. He turned to Holt, eyes wide with panic. "Holt, I didn't know about this." Holt opened his mouth, but couldn't speak. He knew only one thing mattered in this moment, They had assaulted a woman in front of a rear admiral of naval special warfare, a man who could with a single phone call flip the entire Magnolia Police Department upside down in one day. Cross drew in a quiet breath, not long, but enough to pull in the air the whole street. He glanced down at Mrs. Naomi, his gaze softening briefly, then turned sharp again as he looked back at the two officers. "You two," he said, voice low but firm. Each word like a stone have done something unforgivable. No one in the neighborhood had ever heard that voice before, but they understood what came with it, a kind of authority they had never even dared imagine, the kind that could force every official in Magnolia to answer for their actions. Holt swallowed hard, trying to stay composed, but his legs were clearly shaking. What are you doing here?" Cross didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on their faces, eyes that had stared down situations 100 times more dangerous, yet still knew exactly when to step in to save someone being trampled. From a nearby house, someone whispered, "There really is a God, not out of religion, but because after decades of fear, they were finally seeing the two most feared cops in the neighborhood lower their heads before another white man, one who used his strength to protect, not to crush." On the burning street of Magnolia, that truth spread like the first soft breeze before a coming storm. Rear Admiral Aiden Cross stood there, uniform gleaming in the sun, and from the look in his eyes everyone knew this afternoon would not end like the days before. Cross stood still for a moment, letting the air drift by slowly like heavy water. Maddox and Holt looked at him like two men, just realizing they were standing on the edge of a cliff they'd never known they were approaching. Cross didn't have to raise his voice. His presence alone was enough to cast silence over the entire street. He looked at Holt, then Maddox. His gaze was no longer a warning. It was the look of someone who had understood every trick of the men in front of him long ago. "I reported your bribery files to NCIS 3 months ago." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the certainty of someone used to sending in reports that even high-ranking officials had to read carefully. Holt froze Cross's words, hitting him square in the chest. He looked over at Maddox's face, pale, stripped of all his usual bravado. Maddox swallowed his leg, twitching slightly from panic. You've been watching us?" he asked, barely getting the words out. The question didn't carry defiance. It carried the fear of someone who thought he was invisible only to realize he'd been watched all along. Cross didn't take his eyes off them. "I watch evil. Doesn't matter what uniform it wears." The words dropped like a stone on the pavement, echoing inside the minds of everyone hiding behind the curtains. For years, they had seen police abuse, beatings, disappearances, and violence that had become routine. They hadn't dared stand up because they had nothing to fight back with against men wearing badges. But a rear admiral from Naval Special Warfare had just looked two cops in the face and said he watched evil, not the poor. That made a few people inside their homes suck in a sharp breath, hands trembling again, but this time not out of fear for their lives. Maddox took a small step back, trying to look calm, though his throat pulsed with each breath. You really reported it." Cross tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing like he was watching their every move. 3 months. I sent in a file so thick NCIS had to form a dedicated team for Magnolia. He paused briefly, his tone steady. "They're on their way, and I'm only standing here to make sure neither of you kills anyone else." That line made Holt's eyes go wide. He turned to Maddox as if searching for answers, but Maddox looked back at him with the same confusion, unable to hide it. They had always believed that everything they did would stay buried in this poor neighborhood where no one dared speak and no one listened. But Cross had just shattered that illusion with a few sentences. From inside the house on the left, the old man who had earlier warned, "Don't go out," was now standing frozen, his hands gripping the doorframe so tight his knuckles had gone white. He had heard rumors about people going missing after being stopped by police at night. No one in the neighborhood had spoken up because the missing person was a troubled young man the cops had always targeted. But everyone knew that the boy would never leave Magnolia without the old pair of shoes his mother treasured. Cross spoke each word with weight. "Do you two remember the disappearance of that boy Jamal Reed last year?" Holt instantly turned his face away while Maddox squinted, trying to fake confusion, but couldn't hide the flicker of fear in his eyes. Cross looked straight at them. "I came to Magnolia for the first time because of that case." His voice was low, but it carried all the way to the furthest bystanders. "I read the report and saw that half the truth was missing. I went around asking people. No one dared say anything, but when I looked into their eyes, I knew every one of them knew something they were too afraid to speak. The whole neighborhood felt like a gust of wind had swept through it all at once. A woman let her hand with the phone drop to her side, tears spilling from her eyes uncontrollably. A child clutched their mother's hand tightly. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the name Jamal Reed. The 17-year-old boy was reported missing after a nighttime traffic stop. 3 days later, the police concluded he had run away from home, and the case was quietly closed. But the people knew he wasn't the type to run. He had never gone more than 1 block away from this neighborhood. Maddox took a sharp breath, his voice coming out warped. We didn't. Cross cut him off, his voice cold as stone. "That will be reopened." He bent down, slightly picked up the cup of liquid Maddox had dropped earlier. "But today," he said, looking up, locking eyes with both of them, "the only thing I care about is whether she lives." He pointed at Mrs. Naomi, who was still trying to lift her head, despite the pain in her back from Holt's weight. A long silence settled over the street. The midday heat seemed to ease, not because the weather had changed, but because everyone's mind had shifted to something else. They no longer looked at Cross with surprise, but with the eyes of people who, after decades buried in fear, were finally seeing hope. Cross placed the cup far out of reach of Maddox and Holt. He walked over to Mrs. Naomi, slipped one arm under her shoulders to help her sit up. The angled sunlight lit up the medals and the gold trident on his chest. To the people of Briarwood Bend, that image was like a beam of light they had never seen shine on this street before. Holt's face changed when he saw Cross helping Mrs. Naomi. "You came here because of Jamal, didn't you?" he asked in a shaky voice like he was afraid of the answer. Cross didn't turn around. He spoke while steadying Mrs. Naomi. "I came because of Jamal, but I stayed because of you two. That you two wasn't yelled, wasn't harsh, but the contempt in it was enough to make Maddox and Holt feel the ground sinking under their feet." He raised his head eyes, scanning the houses with doors slightly ajar. 20 years of silence ends now, and it ends today. The atmosphere on the street in Briarwood Bend changed completely after Cross spoke. The fear that had hung thick like smoke for 20 years began to thin, then dissolve with each slow creak of doors opening, doors that had always stayed shut whenever a police car rolled by. The people, those who had learned to bow their heads just to get through each day, stepped out one by one, their movements slow and shaky, but they no longer stepped back. A young woman, holding her child, was the first to come out, still holding her phone, which had been recording the whole time. Her breath trembled, but her eyes no longer looked away. She stood behind Cross as if his presence was the only shield she'd ever had in her life. Then came the old man next door, the one who had said, "Don't go out," when it all began. He leaned on the door frame, then stepped forward, his legs weak but his posture straighter than usual. His wife followed him, eyes red but no longer covering her mouth to muffle her sobs. Across the street, another door opened. A young man in a worn t-shirt stepped down the porch steps, still holding his phone. But this time, he wasn't filming in secret from behind a curtain. He held it high in front of him like a statement. Other houses followed. More people appeared. Some held hands, some stood alone, but all of them looked straight at Maddox and Holt. The once silent street now filled with footsteps, soft, but each one pressing more weight onto the backs of two officers who had grown used to unchecked power. The silence turned into pressure, and then a voice rose from the middle of the crowd. A middle-aged man, lean with a sun-worn face from a lifetime of outdoor labor, stood tall and spoke loud and clear. "You don't scare anybody anymore. The words weren't shouted, but they were firm, cutting through the fear Briarwood Bend had lived with for 2 decades like a blade. Maddox flinched, unfamiliar with the feeling of someone daring to say that to his face. Holt turned too, his eyes losing their usual smug certainty, now replaced with unease and confusion. A young mother raised her phone higher, making sure the frame captured Cross, Maddox, and Holt. A man stepped beside her, raising his phone from the same angle. Then another joined, and another. Soon, the whole street was filled with phones held high, hundreds of eyes staring back at the true faces of 2 cops. No more hiding, no more watching from behind the curtains. Holt stepped back half a step, looked at the sea of phones, and snapped, "Turn those damn cameras off." He shouted louder than usual, his voice cracking with both fear and anger, because he knew today's footage wasn't like those grainy clips filmed through windows. Today, there were witnesses. A rear admiral was standing right there in uniform with the gold trident and 2 silver stars gleaming as evidence. But no one stopped. If anything, the phones rose even higher. One woman even stepped forward, shielding her child behind her eyes, locked on Holt. A group of young men formed a line, holding their phones high to capture every detail, Maddox clutching his wrist, Holt looking shaken. There were so many people that the street, usually wide and open, now felt as packed as a church on Sunday morning. Maddox stared at the scene, his face turning pale and purple. He had never dealt with a moment where the people he called trash stood united like this. Every phone was a living piece of evidence, a mirror reflecting his guilt. He leaned toward Holt and whispered just loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear, "Holt, they've got it all on camera." Holt clenched his jaw, the veins on his neck rising. "Shut up," he snapped at Maddox, but his voice had lost its edge. He turned back to the crowd. "Put your phones down." No one moved. An old man stood right in front, not holding a phone, but staring straight at Holt. His eyes, clouded with age, were strangely bright in that moment. "Nobody's putting anything down," he said slowly. "We let you go too far for too long." That line was the final thread snapping. The people who had been standing behind Cross stepped forward half a step and stopped. They didn't attack, didn't shout, but their presence formed a human wall. No weapons, no yelling, just sheer numbers, and it was stronger than any punch. A woman on the left spoke up, voice soft but steady. "Today, we're standing tall." Holt turned to Cross, searching for a sliver of authority to cling to. "Do something," he said, trying to sound firm, but the shake in his throat betrayed him. "You're an officer. You're supposed to control this crowd." Cross looked at him slowly. "They're not a crowd. They're the people of this neighborhood, and they're doing what's right." Holt stiffened like he'd been slapped. Maddox stared at the ground. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, clung to her mother's leg and whispered, "Mom, is that man saving Ms. Naomi?" The mother placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, eyes still fixed on Cross like she was witnessing something sacred. "Yes, sweetheart." He came to put an end to this. Every word from the people became strength. No one stood still out of fear anymore. No one hid behind curtains. The phones, held high, looked like flags marking the start of something new. Holt stepped back, and for the first time in his career as a cop in Magnolia, he understood that his power had just been stripped away by the simple act of people he had once dismissed standing up. Cross knelt down beside Ms. Naomi, his movements slow and steady, as if he was deliberately trying to slow everything down after the chaos of just a few minutes ago. The calmness in his actions was a sharp contrast to the cold force he had just shown Maddox and Holt when the air had been tight, like a drawn string, and the heat from the sun baked the asphalt beneath their feet. He placed one hand gently under her elbow, the other behind her back, lifting her from the still warm ground. His hands were large and firm, bringing a kind of safety that felt completely different from the hands that had shoved or yanked her in the past. Miss Naomi trembled slightly, not just from exhaustion, but from the shock that hadn't yet left her. Her breathing came in thin, broken waves, each breath fighting its way through layers of old fear rooted deep over decades. Still, she lifted her chin, forcing herself to see the face of the man who had pulled her back from the thin line between life and death, as if she had to be sure he was real, that this wasn't just a desperate dream. Cross leaned in a little closer, so she wouldn't have to strain her neck to look up. His voice was deep, low, and quiet, yet even the people nearby could hear the sincerity in it. "Are you all right?" he asked, not out of obligation, and not as some polite gesture. His words carried the weight of real presence as an anchor dropped into a storm of memory and fear, something solid she could hold on to after the moments when she thought she might not survive. In that moment, all the noise around them seemed to pull back, leaving only the sound of her breathing and the steady gaze of the man in front of her. Miss Naomi looked at him. Her eyes, clouded with age, now welled with tears, but they weren't tears of physical pain. It was something deeper, rising up without warning, a mix of relief, leftover fear, and something she hadn't dared to name in years' hope. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling her heart still beating, and drew in a deep breath, as if gathering all her courage to say what had been buried inside her for a lifetime. Her voice was soft, but clear enough that those nearby could hear every word. "I lived through the burning torches of the KKK through nights, sleeping under the bed, 'cause we were scared they'd come knocking." She paused, her throat tightening, and when she spoke again, her voice cracked, not from weakness, but because the memory was too heavy. "But I never thought I'd see this day." The words didn't land with noise, but they carried the weight of 70 years of fear, 70 years of enduring violence, discrimination, and injustice as if it were just part of life. They made all of Briarwood Bend fall silent for a beat, as if everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. The elders closest to her bowed their heads, their shoulders sinking slightly, because they understood exactly what she meant. They had lived through locked doors at night, through hateful stares, through all the times they had to stay quiet just to survive. The younger ones widened their eyes, realizing for the first time that Ms. Naomi wasn't just talking about today or the fall she'd taken. She was talking about a lifetime of being pushed down, with no one ever stepping in to shield her. Cross gave her arm a gentle squeeze, not to hold her in place, but to make sure she felt his presence solid and unwavering. He didn't turn to look at Maddox or Holt, didn't spare a glance for the ones who had been threats just minutes before. He looked only at her and said, his voice not loud, but perfectly clear, "You're not standing alone." It was a simple sentence, no grand flourish, but it had the power to lift all of Briarwood Bend out of the pit they'd been trapped in for far too long. Each word landed like a stone, set down to build a foundation for whatever came next. He spoke like someone who knew he wouldn't turn his back or let go halfway through. Miss Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, and the tears came, because those words had struck the deepest part of a loneliness she'd lived with for 70 years. When she opened her eyes again, the first thing she saw wasn't just Cross, it was the people behind him lined up along the street. Each one wore a different expression, some still afraid, some angry, some unsure, but all of them looked at her with a rare kind of empathy in this neighborhood. A young woman placed her hand on her child's shoulder, as if trying to burn this moment into the child's memory so they could grow up in a place safer than the one she had known. An old man bowed his head slightly, hand pressed to his chest, a simple salute filled with deep respect for Ms. Naomi. Cross adjusted his posture, ready to help her to her feet, but she gently signaled that she wanted to stand on her own. Still, he supported her, his hand hovering ready in case she lost balance. Only when she stood firm, though her legs still trembled slightly, did he let go. That action wasn't just physical support, it was a quiet reminder to everyone watching that Mrs. Naomi still had strength, and more importantly, she still had the right to stand tall in front of those who once tried to crush her. The air around them seemed to soften, not because the sun was less harsh, but because a small seed of belief had just been planted in everyone's heart. A young woman nearby broke into sobs, no longer covering her mouth like before. The middle-aged man who had shouted, "You don't scare anyone anymore," quietly wiped his tears and stepped closer as if just standing near her now was a way to protect Mrs. Naomi. Cross turned to look at the growing crowd. His gaze was no longer as sharp as it had been with Maddox. In it was recognition, respect, and an unspoken promise. He didn't give a speech about justice. He didn't offer lofty words or grand commitments. He just nodded, a simple nod, but enough for the entire street to understand that this moment was a foundation they had never had before. Mrs. Naomi adjusted her blouse, her hand still trembling but her face much calmer now. She looked at Cross, then at the rooftops and familiar faces that had lived alongside her since she was young. "I thought the day someone would stand up for us would never come," she said, her voice now steady. Then she turned to Cross. "Thank you, not just for me, but for all of us." Those around her took deep breaths, as if they too had drawn strength from her words. A young man placed his hand gently on her shoulder and said, "You're not alone anymore." That sentence passed from one person to another, quiet but clear, each voice a piece of the unity Briarwood Bend had waited for so long. In that moment, Cross stood on the dusty road beside Mrs. Naomi, beside a community he had just given hope back to. This wasn't a victory, and it wasn't the end of the violence, but it was a necessary human moment to open the next chapter of the story. It was the day the people of Briarwood Bend would always remember, the day a rear admiral of naval special warfare placed his hand beneath the shoulder of an elderly black woman and told her she did not stand alone. The sound of engines rumbled from afar, at first just a faint vibration in the hot air, then growing clearer as 3 black SUVs appeared at the end of the street. The people of Briarwood Bend turned their heads instinctively. A few stepped back slightly, but no one ran. The vehicles moved forward at a steady pace, no sirens, no flashing lights, but the way they drove carried a quiet authority that made both Maddox and Holt freeze in place. When the vehicles stopped, the doors opened, almost in unison. A team of investigators stepped out, wearing jackets labeled County Internal Investigations. They stood, upright eyes scanning the scene quickly. None of them looked at the residents with suspicion. Their focus went straight to Maddox, Holt, and the spilled chemical container on the ground, then to Miss Naomi, who was still being supported by Cross. Their assessment was immediate. They knew this wasn't a false report, wasn't a misunderstanding. It was serious violence with signs of attempted murder. The lead investigator, a brown-skinned woman in her early 40s, walked toward Cross. "Rear Admiral Cross," she asked, her tone respectful but urgent. Cross gave a single nod. "The file I sent 3 months ago," he said. "You're seeing the rest of it today." She nodded back, then turned toward the 2 local officers, Cole Maddox, Ryan Holt. "You are under arrest for assaulting a civilian, intentional infliction of serious injury, attempted murder using chemical agents, and participating in a bribery ring connected to 3 reopened investigations." Maddox let out a twisted laugh, like a man grasping at the last thread of something he believed could still save him. He pointed to his own chest, voice rising in panic. "I'm a cop. I've got rights," he yelled, as if shouting his title could still make people back away like it always had before. But no one backed away. None of the investigators paused. None of the residents flinched or lowered their heads. Cross looked at Maddox, his gaze cold like someone who had just stepped off a battlefield. "Rights don't belong to killers." He said it slowly and clearly, each word stripping Maddox down to the last layer of defense. Maddox stepped back, but one of the investigators was already moving in, twisting his arm behind his back. Maddox hissed in pain, his wrist still aching from where Cross had bent it earlier, but the arresting officers showed no sign of sympathy. They cuffed him right there on the spot. Holt was spun around and restrained too. He fought back, but he was no match for the 3 officers handling him. His expression collapsed like a wall that had finally been shattered. Phones rose all across the crowd. No more hiding. The blue glow of screen after screen pointed toward Maddox and Holt as the cuffs clicked around their wrists. The young mother, who had been holding her child earlier, now stood closer, filming from the clearest angle, capturing Maddox's face as it twisted. An old man stepped onto the porch, holding his phone steady, his hand no longer shaking like when he first started recording. The people said nothing. They simply stood and filmed, and their silence was the loudest thing either officer had ever heard. For years, they had bullied this silence out of the neighborhood. Today, that same silence became the most damning evidence. Holt looked around and saw at least 20 phones recording the moment he was handcuffed and pushed toward the SUV. He shouted again, "What the hell are you filming? Turn it off." But his voice dropped to the pavement. Nobody listened. A man nearby, still filming, said loud enough for all to hear, "Let the world see the truth about Briarwood Bend." The lead investigator turned to Cross and gave a grateful nod. "Thank you for keeping her safe," she said. Cross returned the gesture with a solemn look. "Thank you for showing up when it mattered." The two officers were pushed toward the vehicles. Maddox squirmed, but against the strength of 3 investigators, he looked like a child being strapped into a car seat. "You think you can arrest me? I've worked for this town more than 10 years, he shouted, clinging to that last shred of status. The investigator replied, her voice like ice. "Exactly. That's why you're being arrested today." The crowd let out a collective breath as if something heavy had finally been released after years of being held in. Miss Naomi stood in the middle of the street, Cross steadying her by the shoulder so she wouldn't fall, her eyes glistening as she watched both men being taken away. She didn't smile, but her lips trembled slightly, like a silent thank you rising in her throat. A teenage boy standing next to his mother whispered, "Mom, does this mean they're really gone?" She answered, her voice hoarse but firm. "Today, it does." The SUV doors closed. The locks clicked with a cold final sound. As the convoy pulled away from Briarwood Bend, the residents stayed in formation. No one stepping away, making sure with their own eyes that the men who had terrorized them were finally leaving their street with heads down. Cross stood beside Miss Naomi, watching the vehicles disappear. Sunlight caught the silver stars on his shoulder and the gold trident on his chest, making them gleam in the middle of the poor neighborhood. The people looked at him with a mix of respect and gratitude. They knew justice hadn't come from the system today. It had come from one man who had the courage to face evil and step into a place others with more power had long chosen to ignore. As the engine noise faded, silence settled over the street once again. But this time it wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a community that had finally seen the system stand on the right side, if only once in their lives. The trial moved faster than anyone in Briarwood Bend had expected, because the file Cross had submitted 3 months earlier was already sitting on the prosecutor's desk. The case, involving Mrs. Naomi, was only the final spark, one that left the system no more room to delay. That morning, the courtroom was packed, not a single seat left. Residents from the neighborhood stood in rows at the back, some holding phones, others carrying a kind of belief they'd never dared hope for. Mrs. Naomi sat in the witness chair, her back still aching, but her spirit much steadier than the day she was dragged to the ground. On the large screen at the front, the video played. No one spoke as the footage showed Maddox blocking her path, punching her in the stomach, then pinning her down. Holt's mocking voice, Maddox's laughter, Naomi's cries of pain, the sound of boots pressing into her back, all of it rang out sharp and real. There was no denying what was clear in every frame. When the video showed the liquid hitting Naomi's neck and her skin changing color, a few people in the room shut their eyes, unable to watch. A young woman gripped her child's hand, even though the child wasn't in the room. Then came the moment Maddox raised the cup, ready to pour it over her head. And just then, Cross's hand appeared, grabbing his wrist. The entire courtroom seemed to exhale at once. A man in the back whispered, "Right on time." When the footage showed Cross twisting Maddox's wrist and stopping Holt, a few older attendees nodded like they were witnessing a miracle. The prosecutor stood one hand on the table. He looked around the courtroom before turning his eyes to the jury. "What you just saw was not a misunderstanding. It was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of violence fueled by severe racial bias paired with an attempt to murder an elderly citizen and tied to a trail of corruption that has gone on for years." His voice was firm. "Today, we are not putting two police officers on trial. Today, we are putting two criminals in uniform on trial." He read out the charges, each one delivered with the certainty of a man holding all the evidence. Excessive use of force, assault with a dangerous chemical, racially motivated violence, attempted murder to silence a witness, bribery, and obstruction of ongoing investigations. When he reached the charge related to the disappearance of Jamal Reed, the room went silent again. Jamal's mother, sitting on the left side, bowed her head as tears streamed down her face. The defense attorney stood face stiff, trying to appear confident. "Your Honor, this video does not provide full context. My clients believed Mrs. Naomi was monitoring them. She was acting suspicious." A soft wave of protest rippled through the room. The jurors glanced at one another, some visibly irritated. The prosecutor stepped forward. "Suspicious. She's 70 years old. She was picking up heart medication, and you all saw them threaten to pour chemicals over her head. There is no context that justifies that." The defense tried again. "My clients were agitated. They didn't intend to kill anyone. It was a moment of poor judgment under work pressure." The prosecutor cut in. "Work pressure doesn't lead you to take money behind a warehouse. Work pressure doesn't make you threaten to kill a 70-year-old woman. Work pressure doesn't explain why they had corrosive chemicals in their vehicle. This wasn't pressure. This was a choice." The jury nodded in unison when he finished. The people in the back nodded too, as if every word he said was a voice they'd been waiting years to hear. When it came time for testimony, Mrs. Naomi took the stand with Cross's support. She spoke slowly but firmly. "I've lived in Magnolia my whole life. I've been chased by the KKK. I've been stopped by the police for no reason. But I never thought there'd come a day when I'd almost be burned alive in the middle of the street." Her voice trembled slightly at the end, but her eyes never left Maddox and Holt. "I don't want anyone else to ever go through this." The defense tried to challenge her, bringing up her age to imply her memory might be unreliable. But Cross stood and spoke simply. "Video doesn't lie." That one line shut down every last attempt from the defense. The conclusion came quickly. The jury was out for less than an hour. When they returned, everyone already knew what would be said. The foreperson stood voice clear and final. "We find both defendants guilty of hate crimes, attempted murder, abuse of authority, and bribery." A collective sigh filled the courtroom like a wave. The people of Briarwood Bend embraced one another. Some cried in relief. Others stood still, their eyes wet. Mrs. Naomi turned to Cross, placed a hand on his arm, and said softly, so only he could hear, "This day finally came." Cross nodded, his eyes still fixed on the two men being handcuffed once again and led away. For him, this was not the end, only the first step of justice finally waking up after years of sleep. Night fell slowly over Magnolia, as if the town itself needed time to breathe after a day stretched thin by truth and justice. In the small rented room on the edge of town, a desk lamp cast light over the spread of documents in front of Cross. Old reports, letters from residents, leaked internal records, security camera footage, all layered like a cross-section of history in a place left unattended for far too long. He turned each page slowly, his eyes scanning the details with the patience of someone used to finding what others had tried to cover in polished language. He paused on a page marked with a faint red stamp, a report on a missing boy in Pine Hill from 3 years ago. The way it was written made him frown the familiar scent of a cover-up. He pulled the file closer to the light, underlined several lines, then opened a separate record of a witness statement previously dismissed for lack of evidence. The room was quiet enough to hear the rustle of paper. Cross leaned back in his chair and let out a rare long breath, not from fatigue but to clear space for the clarity he needed before assembling more pieces. Years of experience had taught him to recognize a pattern. Wherever long-term abuse of power was found, there was always a trail of unnamed victims. Magnolia was just one piece, and behind Magnolia there were surely more towns just like it, more red dust roads, more residents who feared the police more than they feared criminals. Suddenly, the corner of the desk vibrated. The secure radio next to the file stack lit up its small screen showing a verification code from a comm system reserved for high-ranking admirals only. Cross reached out and adjusted the volume knob. The signal crackled for a second, then settled into the voice of a dispatcher. "Priority signal from Pine Hill, Georgia," the radio announced in a flat, automated voice. "Incident displays markers similar to Magnolia, requesting confirmation." Cross sat upright, setting his pen down. Pine Hill. He had just been reading that file minutes ago. The instinctive alignment of facts didn't surprise him. He pressed the response button, but before the radio could reply, a familiar voice cut into the frequency. A woman's voice, low, calm, and carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to announce its rank. Aiden. Cross closed his eyes for a second, not from weariness, but because he recognized that the speaker wasn't a dispatcher. It was another admiral, someone of equal rank, someone who didn't break protocol unless it really mattered. She continued, her voice not loud, but sharp. "We just received the Pine Hill report. An elderly woman was stopped by 2 local officers. Behavior nearly identical to Magnolia. Chemicals, threats, attempted assault. The report includes a line, 'Witnesses said they saw a police car hand off a bag to an unknown male behind an abandoned warehouse.' Sound familiar?" Cross rested his elbow on the desk. "Very familiar." He set eyes on the Magnolia file, still open, the lines he had marked glowing under the lamplight. There was a half-second pause. Then the woman asked directly, "Aiden, are you ready?" No swelling music, no speech, just a plain military-style question, clear, direct, stripped of drama. She wasn't just asking about the task. She was asking if he was ready to go deeper into the fracture lines of a long-standing system, ready to face more towns like Magnolia, ready to shine a light on places where darkness had become so normal that people forgot it was supposed to be temporary. Cross stared at the window pane where his shadow stretched long across the floor. He didn't hesitate, always ready. The radio gave a soft tone of confirmation, then went silent, leaving Cross alone in a quiet room once again. But the quiet now was different. It carried the breath of a new mission, a new town in Georgia that needed him. He gathered the Magnolia files into one stack, tied them with a string, and placed them on the left side of the desk. He opened his bag, slipped in the fresh notes, and glanced at the photo of Miss Naomi someone had handed him earlier that afternoon. She was smiling faintly, but standing tall. That was why he did this. Not for medals, not for reputation. For people like her, for communities like Briarwood Bend, for small towns the world had stopped noticing. He pulled on his jacket, tied his boots, and checked the radio one more time. His footsteps echoed quietly in the empty room, steady without doubt. When he opened the door, the night air of Magnolia hit his face, the scent of warm dirt and dust from a long day still lingering in the air. He looked down the long road ahead. Pine Hill wasn't close, and the next mission wouldn't be easy. But he had said always ready, and for Aiden Cross, that was never a slogan. It was a promise. He left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. His figure disappeared into the night, but tonight the darkness over Magnolia felt lighter than the night before because of the light he left behind. The night in Magnolia was so quiet you could hear every beat of the insect's wings, but that silence was no longer the suffocating kind it used to be. It felt like a breath after the storm. When Cross left town, his footsteps fading off the dusty red road, a larger truth began to stir in the dark. Pine Hill wasn't the only place that needed him, and it certainly wasn't the only place where someone was starting to stand up. In a far state, under the night sky of North Carolina, an old military vehicle sat parked at the edge of a pine forest. Its body was blotched with age, but the engine inside was well maintained, rumbling low and steady, like the breath of someone used to being awake their whole life. A woman stepped out from a small wooden house, carrying a thick folder tied with an old rope. She wore an olive jacket, the shoulders catching the porch light. Her rank, Rear Admiral. The gold trident on her collar was worn down from years of contact. She didn't turn on the lights inside. She just locked the door, got into the vehicle, and placed the folder on the passenger seat. Inside were clipped-together reports, handwritten notes with darkened paper edges, and photos that had once been lost during investigations in small towns. Most of it was tied to forgotten names, minor disappearances, and cries for help dismissed because the senders had no power to be heard. In the corner of one note, a short line was written, "Send it back to where it belongs." She flipped through each file, matching dates and the names tied to each case, then placed them all into a secure bag. Files once buried would now return through official channels without passing through the hands of those who wanted them hidden. She rested her hands on the steering wheel fingers, tightening slightly as she recalled the call from Cross earlier that evening. "Magnolia's done," he said. "Pine Hill's waiting." The way he said it was like they were both looking at the same map, seeing the same bright points and dark spots. It wasn't an order. It was a confirmation they were doing the same work, just from different directions. She nodded to no one, then started the engine. Her olive silhouette melted into the night, leaving only the twin beams of headlights cutting through the thin fog. As the vehicle rolled down a long hill, the hum of the engine echoed between the trees like the metallic heartbeat of a network waking up. Someone knew Cross was in motion, and Cross wasn't moving alone. At that very moment, in a small town called Pine Hill, rumors were beginning to spread from the corner store to the church, then to the trailer park on the edge of town. A man told his neighbor he'd seen a high-ranking officer walking the main street the day before. A young woman said someone had just returned the file about her brother's illegally confiscated car. A young mother shared that someone had called the mayor's office, demanding to reopen old cases that were hastily closed due to lack of evidence. No one knew the person's name. No one saw a clear face, but they all knew one thing: the old files were coming back. Buried stories were being pulled up. And then the same whisper began to echo at the laundromat at the bus depot in the backyards of weekend BBQs. Someone's protecting us. At first, it was a low murmur, almost a cautious hope. But by the third day, it became something everyone had heard. An old man put down his newspaper and told the chess group near the church, "I heard there's a group of admirals looking into these injustices." Someone asked, "Admirals for real?" The old man shrugged. Who else sends sealed files to NCIS? In Magnolia, a teenager clipped the video of Cross rescuing Mrs. Naomi and posted it online with the caption, "Briarwood Bend stood up." Hundreds of comments followed. People from nearby towns said they'd been through something similar. One wrote, "Wish someone like that showed up where I live." And under that comment, a strange account replied with just one sentence, "They're already on the way." The word spread faster than the wind. No one yet realized how big the truth was, that it wasn't just Cross. It wasn't just the Rear Admiral woman in North Carolina. In a border town in Texas, another man in an olive jacket was reviewing a buried case involving local police. In Ohio, Another high-ranking officer had just submitted a federal request for document release. They had no official name, no organization on paper, but they shared one truth: they had seen what happens when the places meant to protect the people become the source of their pain, and they would not let that continue for one more generation. The Admiral Watch Network didn't need meetings, didn't need declarations. It formed because there were people who understood that justice needed to reach the places where the system's light had gone out. Cross was just the first to step out of the shadows, and now that shadow was spreading to other streets, other towns, other forgotten corners. In Pine Hill, a little boy ran into his house yelling, "Mom, there's someone in uniform standing at the end of the street." His mom rushed outside, but the figure was already back in the car, turning the corner. All she saw were the red taillights fading into the night. But she knew what everyone else was thinking. That night, Pine Hill slept less than usual, but it wasn't out of fear. People lay in bed listening to unfamiliar engines roll down the main road and felt a comfort they couldn't quite explain. An old woman told her grandson, "Someone's watching over us now, baby." Ms. Naomi recovered slowly, but each day was steadier than the one before. The burn on her neck left behind a darkened patch of skin slightly wrinkled, like a scar left by the cruelty Maddox had tried to unleash on her. But when she looked in the mirror each morning, she didn't see it as a wound anymore. It felt more like a mark, something she and all of Briarwood Bend would never forget. She touched the skin lightly and told herself, "I'm still here, and they can't touch anyone else." Visitors brought cakes, medicine, and small gifts, but what she valued most were their eyes, no longer lowered, no longer filled with fear. They looked at her directly now, like they were looking at someone who had taken a blow meant for the whole community, one any of them could have received. Briarwood Bend changed faster than anyone expected. Kids who used to hide under porches when they saw a police car now stood and watched, not out of defiance, but because they knew they weren't invisible anymore. Mothers walking to the market moved with quicker steps and straighter backs. On the dirt road in front of the complex, men raised a new street sign to replace the one long gone. In bold, hand-painted letters it read, "Briarwood Bend," like a reminder to the whole town that people lived here. People were watching. People deserved to be heard. Inside the old corner store, a small TV in the corner played news coverage of the trial of Maddox and Holt. People didn't watch out of fear. They watched to remind themselves that the day had really happened. One young woman said to her friend, "If Rear Admiral Cross hadn't come, we'd still be living the same way." Her friend replied, "He didn't just save Ms. Naomi. He saved us from believing nothing would ever change." Children in the neighborhood even acted out the moment. Cross stood in front of Ms. Naomi, stretching out an arm to block an imaginary Maddox, shouting, "Put the can down, now." The adults laughed, but their smiles carried a sense of relief they hadn't felt in a lifetime. 1 week after the trial, on a clear morning, Cross returned to the neighborhood to say goodbye to Ms. Naomi before heading out. He stepped into her small home where the scent of warm tea hung gently in the air. Ms. Naomi sat by the window, a shawl draped lightly over her shoulders. When she saw Cross, she stood up slowly, but her eyes were brighter than when he first met her during the investigation. "I heard you're leaving soon," she said softly, but without sadness. Cross nodded. "I have to go to Pine Hill." She took his hand. "You take care of yourself. And remember, there are more people here who are grateful to you than you realize." He placed his other hand over hers and gave a gentle squeeze. "I did what needed to be done, and you did your part." He glanced at the burn on her neck, a trace of concern in his eyes, but she waved it off. "It reminds me I survived. And I got back up." When he stepped outside, the people were already lined up along both sides of the road, not to say farewell, but to show that they were going to keep living differently after he left Magnolia. An old man spoke first. "Mr. Cross, Magnolia owes you more than we can say." A young mother followed. "Because of you, we're not afraid anymore." A child waved. Come back soon, okay? Cross gave a small smile. He wasn't one for praise, but the way they stood, the way they looked at him, that was something he received with genuine respect. His black SUV sat beneath a tree. The door was already open, the secure radio on the passenger seat quietly pulsing like a steady breath. Cross stood for a moment, looking down the road that had once held so much pain, and now carried the faint light of hope, something he rarely saw in the places he went. He took in the warm breeze of Magnolia one last time, then got into the vehicle. When the engine started, the sound was solid and low, like the opening note of the next mission. He placed the Pine Hill file on the seat beside him, fingers brushing the edge of the document where he'd left his own notes the night before. He looked in the rearview mirror for a second and saw the townspeople still standing, backs, straight eyes steady. He nodded to them one final time, then shifted gears. The SUV rolled out of Briarwood Bend, kicking up a soft cloud of dust into the new morning. As the car reached the highway, the narrator's voice came in, deep, slow, and firm, like a hammer striking ground. Justice will rise. A pause. One town. The image of Briarwood Bend faded smaller in the mirror. One admiral. The image of Pine Hill began to unfold ahead. At a time, a new journey had begun, and justice at last was on its feet. Although the story of Briarwood Bend centers around Mrs. Naomi Maddox Holt and the timely appearance of Rear Admiral Aiden Cross, its deeper lesson reaches beyond one small town or two corrupt officers. It touches a bigger issue, how far power can be abused when no one stands up, and how strong a community can become when it decides to stay silent no longer. From Mrs. Naomi, we see the quiet resilience of those who've spent a lifetime under the weight of discrimination and violence, yet still hold on to kindness. She did nothing wrong, caused no trouble, made no threats, and yet, step by step, she became the symbol of a fear passed down for generations. When that burning drop hit her skin, it wasn't just her pain. It was a wound that echoed for an entire community that had been held down for far too long. And when she stood back up, when she said, "I never thought this day would come," that was the moment Briarwood Bend stood up with her. From Cross, we learn about responsibility. Justice doesn't happen on its own. It takes people, those willing to step into the dark, to face what's wrong, even when the system has turned away again and again. Cross didn't use his rank to show off. He used it to protect. He didn't stay on the sidelines, he acted. He showed that sometimes real strength is simply the courage to say, "That's enough." And he didn't fight to become a hero. He did what needed to be done for those without a voice. From the people of Briarwood Bend, we see the power of unity. For years, they lived like scattered sparks, each one too small to hold up against the wind. But when they realized no one can live in silence forever, they began to rise. One person opened their door, then two, then the whole block. They raised their phones to record the same people who once stepped on them, and this time, they weren't afraid. They said, "We're standing tall now." And for the first time, it wasn't just a phrase, it was a wake-up call. This story isn't meant to inspire with perfect endings. It's here to remind us that injustice isn't rare. It exists in every town, every city, every community. But so does justice. It begins with one person willing to do what's right, then passes to the next, and grows into something bigger than any one of us. The lesson for each of us is this: when you see something wrong, don't look away. When you see someone vulnerable getting hurt, don't stay silent. When you see power being abused, don't assume it's not your problem. Sometimes one action, one voice, or one person like Cross is enough to change an entire town. And sometimes real power doesn't come from rank or title. It comes from the choice to stand on the side of what's right. If this story made you stop and think, share it. Share it so more people can learn. Share it so those who have faced injustice know they're not alone. Share it so those in power understand they're accountable for every decision they make. Thank you for staying with us through the end of Briarwood Bend's journey. This is just one of many stories we want to tell, stories about justice, about rising up, and about people. Don't forget to subscribe to follow more powerful stories, meaningful lessons, and the fight for justice that continues. Justice will rise not just in stories, but in real life.